My entire family agreed I'd be the worst father alive. But I was 3 weeks away from finalizing an adoption. My family and I were sitting there watching my little nephew run around, when out of the blue, my auntie said, "I'm glad the good kid of the family has a child. Can you imagine if the other one spawned a kid?" Everyone giggled, making obvious side glances at me. "God, can you imagine?" my dad said. "That kid would need therapy before kindergarten." I set down my water and announced proudly, "Actually, I'm in the process of adopting a child." The entire table went silent. Then they started laughing even harder. "You're adopting?" My brother Julio nearly spit out his drink. "You don't even have a wife, man. You couldn't hold down a relationship in high school, college, or now." My mom shook her head. "Honey, you can't even keep a plant alive." "How are you going to raise a human being?" she snorted. "Remember when your hamster ran away?" My uncle added, "That animal literally chose to die in the walls rather than stay with you." But none of those things were true. It was Julio who had destroyed the plant by pouring Sprite instead of water, and it was him who took my hamster and blamed it on me. My uncle leaned back in his chair. "Adrian, you can barely take care of yourself. Your apartment's a mess. You eat takeout every night, and you're always forgetting to pay your bills on time. That's not father material. That's a death sentence for the kid." The entire table roared into laughter again, but that only made me more determined. Over the next 6 months, I worked overtime to earn that promotion at work. Better job, better stability, better future for my son. Yeah, my son. 7-year-old Isaac, who'd been bouncing through foster care since he was 3. I made sure our apartment was clean and safe, cabinets filled with food and snacks. I learned to cook meals, take him out to all the places I'd wanted to go as a kid. I showed up to every supervised visit, every meeting, every appointment, even watched parenting videos on YouTube. But it wasn't easy. The first week Isaac moved in, I burned dinner 3 times and he cried himself to sleep asking for his old foster mom. When he got sick with the flu, I panicked so hard I called the nurse hotline 4 times in one night. I forgot about picture day, sent him to school in mismatched socks more times than I can count, and once accidentally used fabric softener instead of detergent for his clothes. There were nights I'd lie awake terrified I was proving my family right, but then Isaac started smiling more. Started running to me when I picked him up from school. Started calling me dad without me having to ask. And I realized I was learning, slowly, messily, but I was learning. Meanwhile, Julio's perfect life was falling apart. His wife had caught him cheating with the babysitter, and they went through an ugly public divorce. His son started getting suspended from school for fighting. But still, my family never joked about Julio being a terrible father. They rallied around him, supported him, told him it'd all work out. 3 months after the adoption was finalized, I received a call from school from his teacher, who boasted about how well-adjusted Isaac was and how much he constantly spoke about me. "You're clearly doing an amazing job," she said warmly. We started talking about more than just Isaac and quickly exchanged numbers, and for the first time, I had someone I really wanted to commit to, someone I knew who would be good to Isaac. But just as things started going great, on Isaac's 8th birthday party, something completely unexpected happened. My whole family came to see the mess, only to find a happy little family that they all said would never happen. None of them could look me in the eye until my brother Julio stumbled in drunk and upset. He looked at me holding Isaac's hand while we cut the cake, and something in him just broke. "You think you're so perfect now?" he yelled. "Playing happy family? That kid's gonna end up just as messed up as you. You're gonna ruin him just like you ruin everything." The room went completely silent. Isaac pressed closer to my side and yelled out weakly, "You're wrong! I love my dad and he's the best." Then my mom stood up. "Julio, that's enough. Adrian has been an incredible father." My dad added awkwardly, "Better than I ever was, honestly." One by one, they each said something about how patient I was with Isaac, how happy he seemed, how I'd stepped up in ways they never expected. My girlfriend, Isaac's teacher, smiled and slipped her hand in mine. "You're the father all kids dream of having, and soon, you'll be the father of 2. She patted her stomach and smiled warmly. The entire family crowded around, giving their congratulations while my brother Julio stood there, turning more and more red. Then something in him snapped. He started laughing maniacally. "This is insane," he said, still laughing, his eyes wild. "You're all buying this? Adrian playing house with some random kid?" He stumbled forward, pointing at me. "I know what you did. I know your secrets. And if you think this little happy ending is real, you're all idiots." He looked right at Isaac and grinned. "Your dad's not who you think he is, kid." My girlfriend pulled Isaac close as Julio backed toward the door. "You'll see. You'll all see." The door slammed behind Julio, and nobody moved for a solid 10 seconds. My family just stood there staring at where he'd been, like they couldn't process what just happened. My mom opened her mouth, but nothing came out. My dad rubbed his face with both hands. I felt Isaac's small hand squeeze mine tighter, and that snapped me back to reality. I bent down and whispered that we should go open his presents in his room, away from all the grown-up stuff. He nodded and we walked down the hallway while I heard my auntie start saying something about Julio needing help. My hands shook as I helped Isaac tear into the wrapping paper on his biggest gift. He pulled out a new bike and his eyes went huge with excitement, but I could barely focus on his happy face because my brain kept spinning through everything Julio might know and everything he might tell people. I made myself smile and nod as Isaac showed me each new toy, but inside I was planning how to protect him from whatever bomb my brother was about to drop. After about an hour of opening presents and playing with new action figures, Isaac's eyes started getting heavy. I tucked him into bed surrounded by his new stuff, and he fell asleep almost instantly, probably worn out from all the party excitement and stress. I walked back to the kitchen where Kieran was cleaning up paper plates and plastic cups. She looked up at me and I could see the worry all over her face. We sat down at the kitchen table without saying anything for a minute. She reached across and took my hand. She asked me straight out if there was something from my past I hadn't told her about, something Julio could use against me. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the fear underneath it. I realized right then that I couldn't let Julio force this conversation, that I needed to be honest with her before he twisted everything into something worse. I took a deep breath and started talking. I told her about my early 20s when I'd struggled with drinking after dropping out of college the first time. I told her about the DUI I got when I was 23, how I'd kept it quiet for years because I was so ashamed. I explained the money problems I'd had back then, the credit cards I'd maxed out and couldn't pay, the debt collectors calling me for 2 straight years. I told her I'd only finished paying everything off about 6 months before I started the adoption process. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just sat there looking at her hands on the table. I felt like I might throw up waiting for her to respond. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. She said she wished I'd trusted her enough to tell her sooner. She said she understood why I was scared to share it, but that hiding it made her wonder what else I might be keeping from her. Then she squeezed my hand and said we'd figure this out together, that my past didn't change how she felt about the man I'd become. The next morning, Isaac came into the kitchen while I was making pancakes and asked why Uncle Julio had been so mad at the party. I flipped a pancake and tried to think of how to explain it without scaring him. I told him that sometimes grown-ups have problems they need to work through, and that Uncle Julio was dealing with some tough stuff that made him act mean. Isaac poured syrup on his pancakes and seemed to think about that for a second. He asked if Uncle Julio was mad at him, and I said no, absolutely not, that this was about grown-up things that had nothing to do with Isaac. He nodded and started eating, then started talking about his new bike and whether we could go to the park later. Just like that, he bounced back to being his normal, happy self. It reminded me that kids can handle way more than we think they can, as long as they feel safe and loved. We spent the rest of the morning at the park, and Isaac rode his new bike around the path about 50 times. That afternoon, my phone rang and I saw it was my mom calling. I almost didn't answer, but Kieran gave me a look that said I should. My mom's voice sounded different from usual, softer maybe. She said she wanted to apologize for Julio's behavior and ask if I was okay. I sat down on the couch because this was the first time in my entire life that my mom had actually checked on how I was feeling about something. She said she'd talked to Julio that morning and he was a mess, but that his problems weren't my responsibility. I told her I appreciated her calling and that I was handling things, but that Isaac had to be my priority right now. She said she understood and that she was proud of how I'd handled everything. We talked for maybe 10 more minutes about normal stuff like Isaac's new bike and the weather. When I hung up, Kieran asked if that went okay, and I said it went better than I expected. Later that evening, after Isaac went to bed, Kieran suggested we should meet with her dad to tell him about the pregnancy before Julio caused more drama. She said she wanted her family to hear the important news directly from us, instead of through some twisted version my brother might spread around. I felt my stomach drop because meeting her dad under these circumstances wasn't exactly ideal. Gene had only met me twice before, and both times he'd been polite but distant, the way dads get when they're not sure about the guy dating their daughter. But Kieran was right that we needed to control our own story. I agreed, and she called her dad right then to set up dinner for later in the week. 3 days later, we drove to Gene's house on the other side of town. He lived in a nice neighborhood with big trees and houses that all looked the same. Kieran knocked on the door, and her dad opened it wearing jeans and a button-up shirt. He shook my hand firmly and invited us in. We sat in his living room and made small talk about work and the weather for about 5 minutes, before Kieran just came out and told him she was pregnant. Gene's face went through about 6 different expressions in 2 seconds. He looked at Kieran, then at me, then back at Kieran. He asked how long we'd been together, and Kieran said almost 5 months. He leaned back in his chair, and I could see him doing the math in his head, probably wondering if I was good enough for his daughter, and worried about how fast everything was moving. He asked me about my job and my apartment, and how I was managing with Isaac. I answered everything honestly while he watched me like he was looking for cracks in my story. Then Kieran jumped in and started explaining how I'd proven myself as a father to Isaac, how patient and dedicated I was, how she'd watched me grow into the role over months of getting to know us both. She said she was confident in our future together, and that she wouldn't have let things get this far if she had any doubts. Gene's face softened a little bit when she said that. He told me he'd heard good things about how I was with Isaac from Kieran and that being a single parent wasn't easy, but I seemed to be handling it well. He said he wanted to be supportive, but that he needed time to process everything. We stayed for another hour talking about practical stuff like doctor appointments and our plans for a bigger apartment. When we left, Gene hugged Kieran and shook my hand again, this time with a little less tension in his grip. Monday at work, I couldn't focus on anything. I kept staring at my computer screen without actually reading what was on it. My coworker Vanessa walked past my desk 3 times before she finally stopped and asked what was wrong. Vanessa had been supportive through the whole adoption process, always asking about Isaac and celebrating the small wins with me. I gave her the basic outline of what happened at the party, how Julio showed up drunk and made threats about exposing my secrets. She pulled up a chair and sat down next to my desk. She reminded me that I'd overcome way worse challenges than a jealous brother, that I'd built a good life despite my past mistakes, and that the people who mattered knew who I really was. She said Julio was clearly spiraling, and that his words said more about him than about me. I felt a little better after talking to her, enough to actually get some work done that afternoon. That night after Isaac went to sleep, my phone started buzzing with text messages. I picked it up and saw they were from Julio. The first one said he knew everything about my past, and that the truth was going to come out whether I liked it or not. The second one said I'd fooled everyone but not him, that he saw right through my act. The third one was just rambling about how I didn't deserve the family I'd built. I screenshot every message and showed them to Kieran. Her face got hard as she read through them. She said if his messages kept coming like this, I might need to think about getting a restraining order. I didn't want to go that far with my own brother, but I also couldn't let him keep threatening me and scaring my family. I saved all the screenshots in a folder on my phone just in case. 2 days later, Isaac's school counselor called and asked if I could come in for a meeting. My first thought was that something was wrong, but she said it was just a check-in about how Isaac was handling the news about becoming a big brother. I scheduled it for the next afternoon and showed up 15 minutes early because I'm always paranoid about being late to anything involving Isaac's school. The counselor was a nice woman in her 40s who'd worked with Isaac a few times before. She said she wanted to touch base about the family changes since those could sometimes affect kids in unexpected ways. Then she smiled and said Isaac seemed really excited about the baby, that he'd been talking about it positively to his classmates and asking questions about what big brothers do. She said he seemed secure and happy, which was exactly what she liked to see in situations like this. I left that meeting feeling better than I had in days, knowing that despite all the drama with Julio, Isaac was okay. That Thursday night, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number I almost didn't recognize because my dad never called me. I stared at the screen for 3 rings before answering, already bracing myself for whatever family drama was coming next. He asked if I wanted to meet for coffee on Saturday morning, just the 2 of us, which had literally never happened in my entire life. My first instinct was to say no and protect myself from whatever lecture or criticism he had planned, but something in his voice sounded different. I told him I could meet him at the diner near his house around 10, then spent the next 2 days wondering what he wanted and whether this was some kind of trap. Saturday morning, I showed up 15 minutes early because I'm always paranoid about being late, and I sat in my car watching the diner entrance until I saw my dad's truck pull into the parking lot. He looked older than I remembered as he walked toward the door, his shoulders a little more hunched than they used to be. Inside the diner, we took a booth by the window and ordered coffee, both of us avoiding eye contact while the waitress filled our cups. My dad cleared his throat 3 times before he finally started talking, admitting he'd been too hard on me growing up, and that he'd spent years projecting his own failures onto me instead of supporting me. He said watching me with Isaac at the birthday party made him realize what real fatherhood actually looked like, and it forced him to confront how badly he'd messed up with both me and Julio. I sat there frozen with my coffee cup halfway to my mouth, not knowing how to process what I was hearing. He kept going, saying he wanted to try building a better relationship if I was willing to give him that chance, and his eyes were actually wet, like he might cry. I didn't know what to say at first because this was the man who'd spent my entire childhood telling me I'd never amount to anything, and now he was sitting across from me apologizing. Eventually, I told him I appreciated the apology, and I was willing to take things slowly, 1 step at a time. We agreed to start with monthly lunches where we could get to know each other as adults, instead of falling back into the same broken patterns from my childhood. The conversation felt awkward and uncomfortable, but also kind of necessary, like lancing an infected wound that had been festering for decades. We finished our coffee and went our separate ways, and I drove home feeling weird and off balance, but maybe a little bit hopeful. Tuesday night the following week, I was helping Isaac with his homework at the kitchen table when someone started pounding on my apartment door. The banging was so loud and aggressive that Isaac jumped in his chair and looked at me with scared eyes. I recognized Julio's voice immediately as he started yelling from the hallway about how I was a fraud and everyone was going to find out the truth. I told Isaac to go to his room and put on his headphones, then I locked his door from the outside before calling the police. Julio kept pounding and screaming while I stayed on the line with the dispatcher, and I could hear other neighbors opening their doors to see what was happening. I called Kieran next and she stayed on the phone with me, her voice calm and steady, while Julio's yelling got more and more incoherent. The police arrived within 10 minutes and I heard them in the hallway telling Julio to calm down and step away from my door. He started arguing with them, his words slurred and angry, and then I heard the sound of handcuffs clicking. One of the officers knocked and identified himself, so I opened the door to find Julio being led away in restraints, his face red and his eyes unfocused. The officer took my statement about the harassment and the threatening texts, then informed me that Julio was arrested for public intoxication and disturbing the peace. He suggested strongly that I should consider filing for a restraining order, given how Julio's behavior was escalating and becoming more threatening. After they left, I unlocked Isaac's room and found him curled up on his bed with his headphones still on, and it took me 20 minutes to convince him that everything was okay and he was safe. The next morning, I took off work and spent hours at the courthouse gathering all the documentation I needed for the restraining order filing. I printed out every threatening text message Julio had sent, wrote a detailed timeline of his increasingly unstable behavior, and attached the police report from the apartment incident. The clerk at the family court window walked me through the paperwork and scheduled a hearing date for 2 weeks out. My hands shook while I filled out the forms because this felt like such a huge step to take against my own brother, but I kept thinking about Isaac's scared face and knew I had to protect him. I submitted everything and got a temporary order that would be in effect until the hearing, which meant Julio legally had to stay away from me and my family. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt exhausted and sad, but also relieved that I was finally taking action, instead of just hoping Julio would get better on his own. That afternoon, my mom called with her voice thick from crying, saying she'd heard about Julio's arrest and didn't know what to do or how to help either of us. She kept saying she was torn between her 2 sons and felt like she was losing both of us to this conflict. I told her as gently as I could that Julio needed professional help that I couldn't provide, and that my first priority had to be protecting Isaac from his instability. She cried harder and asked if there was any way to fix this without courts and restraining orders, but I stood firm. I explained that Julio had crossed too many lines and that Isaac's safety wasn't something I could compromise on, even for family peace. My mom eventually accepted what I was saying even though she clearly didn't like it, and she promised she'd try to get Julio into some kind of treatment program. After we hung up, I sat on my couch staring at nothing for a long time, feeling the weight of everything that was happening. The next weekend, Kieran and I decided to focus on something positive and started looking at bigger apartments since we'd need more space with a baby coming. We brought Isaac along and made it fun, letting him imagine which room would be his and talking about how we'd decorate. At the third apartment we viewed, Isaac got really excited about a place that had 2 bedrooms, plus a small office that could become a nursery. He started planning out loud about what color we should paint the baby's room and asking if he could help pick out furniture for his future sibling. Watching him get so invested in our growing family made all the stress with Julio feel more manageable, like we were building something real that nobody could take away from us. We put in an application for that apartment that same day and crossed our fingers that we'd get approved. 2 weeks later, I sat in the courtroom waiting for the restraining order hearing to start, with Kieran beside me and a folder full of evidence on my lap. Julio showed up 10 minutes late looking disheveled and angry, with wrinkled clothes and uncombed hair. He was representing himself and immediately started rambling to the judge about how I was manipulating everyone and destroying our family. The judge let him talk for about 2 minutes before cutting him off and asking to see my documentation. I handed over the police report, the screenshots of threatening texts, and my written statement about the escalating harassment. Julio tried to interrupt several times, but the judge told him firmly to wait his turn. After reviewing everything, the judge granted my request for a 1-year restraining order, stating that the documented harassment and police involvement showed a clear pattern of threatening behavior. Julio's face turned red and he started to argue, but the bailiff stepped forward and the judge warned him that any violation would result in immediate arrest. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt safer than I had in weeks, even though I knew this was just going to make Julio angrier. 3 days after the hearing, my auntie called asking me to drop the restraining order because it was tearing the family apart. She said everyone was upset and taking sides and that I was making things worse by involving the courts in family business. I told her firmly that Julio's behavior was what caused the problems, not my response to protect my family from his instability. She pushed back, saying I was being too harsh and that Julio just needed time and support, but I refused to back down. I explained that Isaac had nightmares after the apartment incident and that his sense of safety mattered more than keeping family peace. My auntie went quiet for a minute, then said she understood even though she clearly wasn't happy with my answer, and she hung up without saying goodbye. I knew this meant more family drama was coming, but I didn't care anymore because Isaac's well-being was the only thing that mattered. The following week, I had my scheduled post-adoption check-in with Isaac's social worker, and I decided to be completely transparent about everything happening. I disclosed the whole situation with Julio, including the restraining order and the apartment incident, and I also told her about my past DUI from my early 20s that I'd kept quiet about for years. She listened carefully and took notes, then surprised me by saying my transparency showed good judgment and responsibility. She pointed out that I'd been sober for years, that I'd built a stable life, and that my immediate action to protect Isaac from Julio demonstrated exactly the kind of parenting instincts she liked to see. She noted everything in her file and said there were no concerns about Isaac's placement, which made me feel like I could finally breathe again. Walking out of that meeting, I realized that being honest about my past and my current struggles was actually making me a better parent, not a worse one. 2 weeks later, Kieran and I sat in the waiting room at the women's health clinic for her first ultrasound appointment. Isaac was at the school and I kept checking my watch even though we had plenty of time. The nurse called Kieran's name and we followed her back to a small dim room with an ultrasound machine. Kieran lay back on the exam table and lifted her shirt while the technician squirted cold gel on her stomach. The screen flickered to life and suddenly there it was, this tiny flickering blob that was our baby. The technician pointed out the heartbeat and measured different parts while typing notes. I stared at that screen thinking about how a year ago, my family laughed at the idea of me being a father. Kieran reached over and squeezed my hand without looking away from the monitor. She leaned close and whispered that she was proud of me. My eyes got wet and I had to blink a few times because I didn't want to cry in front of the technician. We left with printouts of the ultrasound images and I tucked them carefully in my wallet. The following Saturday, Gene Mercer called and asked if I wanted to go to a baseball game with him, just the two of us. I said yes, even though it felt like some kind of test. We met at the stadium and found our seats in the upper deck. Gene bought us hot dogs and beer, though I stuck with soda. For the first few innings, we just watched the game and made small talk about the players. Then during the 7th inning stretch, he asked about my job. I told him about the promotion I'd earned and how the stability helped during the adoption process. He nodded and asked what my plans were for the future. I explained I wanted to provide for Kieran and both kids, maybe eventually buy a house with a yard. He asked direct questions about my commitment to his daughter and whether I understood what I was taking on. I met his eyes and told him I'd never been more sure about anything in my life. By the 9th inning, he seemed more relaxed. He clapped me on the shoulder when our team scored and said he was glad Kieran found someone solid. We walked back to the parking lot, and he shook my hand firmly before we drove off in separate directions. That Tuesday evening, I was scrolling through Facebook when I got a message request from someone named Maria Torres. I clicked on her profile and realized it was Julio's ex-wife. My finger hovered over the delete button, but curiosity won. She wrote that she wanted to apologize for Julio's behavior at Isaac's party. She explained he'd been spiraling since their divorce, and his drinking had gotten much worse over the past few months. She said Julio had always been jealous of me, even though from the outside it looked like he had everything. The message was long and detailed about his struggles with anger and alcohol. She said she felt guilty for not warning me sooner about how unstable he'd become. I sat there staring at my phone for a long time before typing a response. I thanked her for reaching out and told her I appreciated the apology, but I made it clear I couldn't help Julio until he helped himself. I explained that I had to prioritize my own family's safety, especially Isaac's. She responded quickly saying she completely understood. She wrote that she was trying to protect their son from Julio's problems too. We messaged back and forth a few more times and found unexpected common ground in our situations. Both of us had kids to protect from Julio's mess. Before logging off, she wished me luck with the new baby and said Isaac was fortunate to have me. The next morning, Isaac sat at the breakfast table pushing cereal around his bowl. He looked up at me with those big, serious eyes and asked why we hadn't seen Uncle Julio in a while. I set down my coffee and chose my words carefully. I told him that Uncle Julio was dealing with some grown-up problems and needed space to work on getting better. Isaac nodded slowly like he was processing this information. Then he asked if Uncle Julio was sick. I said, sort of, that sometimes adults have problems they need to fix before they can be around other people. Isaac was quiet for a minute, then asked if we could send Uncle Julio a card to help him feel better. Something in my chest tightened at how kind and pure that question was. I told him that was a really nice idea, and we could make one together this weekend. At work on Thursday, Vanessa stopped by my desk during lunch break. She had that excited look on her face like she was bursting with news. She told me there was an opening for a senior position in our department. Better pay, better benefits, more responsibility. She said I should apply because she thought I had a real shot at getting it. I pulled up the job posting right there and started filling out the application. For the first time in my life, I felt actually confident in my abilities. Not fake confidence to cover up insecurity, but real solid belief that I could handle this. I submitted the application before the end of the day, and Vanessa gave me a thumbs up from across the office. Friday afternoon, my mom called while I was picking Isaac up from the school. She asked if Kieran, Isaac, and I would come to Sunday dinner at her house. Her voice sounded almost nervous, like she expected me to say no. I told her we'd be there, and she seemed relieved. After I hung up, I told Kieran about the invitation. She bit her lip and admitted she was nervous about it. We spent Saturday evening preparing Isaac for the possibility that dinner might be awkward. We explained that sometimes family gatherings can be uncomfortable, but that we'd all stick together. Isaac seemed fine with it and asked if Grandma would make her chocolate cake. Sunday dinner started stiff and uncomfortable. We sat around the dining room table and everyone was extra polite in that forced way. My mom passed dishes and asked Kieran questions about her teaching career. What grade did she teach? How long had she been at that school? What made her want to become a teacher? Kieran answered everything with grace, even though I could tell she was nervous. My mom actually listened to the answers instead of just waiting to talk. She asked follow-up questions about Kieran's pregnancy and whether she planned to keep teaching after the baby came. Meanwhile, my dad pulled out an old board game and sat on the floor with Isaac. I watched them play together and saw hints of what kind of grandfather he could be if we could move past all our history. Isaac laughed when my dad made a silly move and my dad ruffled his hair. The whole scene felt surreal compared to that first family dinner where they'd mocked me. After we finished eating, my uncle pulled me aside into the hallway. He looked uncomfortable and kept clearing his throat. Finally, he said he wanted to apologize for the cruel jokes he'd made at that first family gathering. He admitted he'd just been following the family's pattern of making me the scapegoat without thinking about the real harm it caused. He said watching me with Isaac made him realize how wrong they'd all been. I stood there looking at him and felt the weight of all those years of being the family joke. I told him I accepted his apology, but that it would take time to rebuild trust. He nodded and said he understood, and that he'd work on earning it back. Wednesday afternoon, my phone rang while I was in a meeting at work. I saw it was Isaac's school and stepped out to answer. The principal's voice was tense and professional. She said there was a situation and I needed to come to the school immediately. My stomach dropped and I grabbed my keys and ran. I drove there, breaking probably every speed limit. When I pulled into the parking lot, there were 2 police cars parked near the entrance. I ran inside and found Isaac sitting in the counselor's office looking small and scared. The principal explained that teachers had spotted Julio acting strange in the parking lot during pickup time. He'd been pacing and yelling and trying to get close to the building. They'd initiated a lockdown and called the police. Officers arrived and arrested him for violating the restraining order. Isaac was safe the whole time, but he'd heard the lockdown announcement and got scared. I knelt down and hugged Isaac tight while rage burned in my chest. Julio's problems had now touched my son's sense of security at his own school, the one place that should always feel safe for him. I thanked the counselor and principal for protecting Isaac. Then I carried him out to the car and drove home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel the entire way. That night, Isaac asked me 3 times if the doors were locked, and twice if someone could get into his window. I checked everything in front of him and sat on the edge of his bed until he fell asleep. My phone buzzed around midnight with a text from my mom asking me to call her as soon as possible. I stepped into the hallway and dialed her number. She told me Julio had been arrested at the school and taken to the county jail. The judge set his bail at $15,000 this time, instead of the original $5,000. She said he also ordered Julio to get evaluated for substance abuse before any future hearings. Then she asked if I could help pay the bail money because she and my dad didn't have that much available right now. I told her no. She went quiet for a long moment before asking me to reconsider because Julio was still my brother and he needed family support. I explained that giving him money to avoid consequences wouldn't help him get better. She started crying and said I was being cruel and that Julio was going through a hard time. I stayed firm and told her that protecting Isaac was my first priority and that Julio needed to face what he'd done. She hung up on me. Isaac woke up screaming that first night. I ran to his room and found him sitting up in bed with tears running down his face. He said he dreamed that Uncle Julio broke into the school and took him away. I sat next to him and turned on his nightlight and told him that would never happen because the school had good security and I would always protect him. He asked if Uncle Julio was mad at him. I promised him that Julio's problems had nothing to do with him and that none of this was his fault. We sat there for an hour while I rubbed his back and told him stories about funny things that happened when I was his age. He finally fell back asleep around 3 in the morning. The same thing happened the next night and the night after that. Each time he woke up scared and each time I stayed with him until he felt safe enough to sleep again. Kieran came over on the 4th night and found me exhausted on the couch after getting Isaac back to sleep. She sat down and put her hand on my arm. She suggested we start family therapy to help Isaac process everything that had been happening. I agreed immediately because I could see the fear in Isaac's eyes was getting worse instead of better. The family therapist's office had comfortable chairs and toys in the corner for younger kids. Isaac sat between me and Kieran during our first session while the therapist asked him about school and his friends and his favorite things to do. Then she gently asked about the scary thing that happened at the school. Isaac looked down at his hands and said he heard the lockdown alarm and got really scared. The therapist nodded and asked what made him scared. He said he worried that someone bad was trying to hurt people. She asked if he knew who the person was and he shook his head, even though I knew he probably figured it out. We went back every week after that. The therapist taught Isaac some breathing exercises to use when he felt scared. She also taught me better ways to reassure him without accidentally making his fears bigger. Kieran joined some of the sessions to show Isaac that she was part of our family team and that she would help keep him safe too. After about a month, Isaac's nightmares started happening less often. He still had them sometimes, but not every single night like before. My boss called me into her office on a Thursday afternoon. I walked in expecting another project assignment, but instead she told me I was promoted to senior analyst. The position came with a $20,000 raise and better health insurance that would cover more of the pregnancy costs. She said I'd earned it through consistent hard work and reliability over the past 2 years. I thanked her and tried to keep my expression professional, but inside I felt like jumping up and down. That evening, Vanessa insisted on taking me out to celebrate. We went to a bar near the office and she ordered a beer while I stuck with soda. She raised her glass and made a toast to my success and to proving everyone wrong about what I could accomplish. I clinked my glass against hers and felt grateful to have a friend who'd supported me through the whole adoption process and everything with Julio. My mom called 2 weeks after Julio's arrest to tell me about his court-mandated evaluation results. The evaluator determined he had a serious alcohol problem and recommended inpatient treatment. The judge ordered him to complete a 30-day rehab program at a facility about an hour away. My mom said Julio had finally agreed to go after fighting it at first. She sounded hopeful that this might actually help him turn things around. I felt a small flicker of hope too, but I wasn't ready to let my guard down or trust that 1 month would fix years of problems. I told my mom I was glad he was getting help, but that I needed to see real long-term change before I'd consider letting him back into Isaac's life. She said she understood even though I could hear the disappointment in her voice. Kieran and I spent 3 weekends looking at apartments in our price range. Most of them were too small or in bad neighborhoods or had landlords who seemed sketchy. Then we found a 3-bedroom place on a quiet street in the same school district where Isaac already went. It had a small fenced yard in the back and enough space for Isaac to have his own room and for us to set up a nursery for the baby. The kitchen was updated and the landlord seemed reasonable when we met him. We signed the lease that same day. Isaac came with us to see it before we signed, and he ran from room to room getting excited about having a bigger space. He picked out which room he wanted and started planning where he'd put his toys and his bed. Watching him happy and excited made all the apartment hunting worth it. Moving day came faster than expected. I'd packed up most of our stuff over the previous week, but there were still boxes everywhere when my dad showed up that Saturday morning. He'd never offered to help me move before, so I was surprised when he called and asked what time to arrive. We worked together carrying boxes down the stairs and loading them into the moving truck I'd rented. He didn't say much at first, but as we carried a heavy bookshelf together, he told me he was proud of how I'd handled everything with Julio. He said I'd shown more strength and better judgment than he ever had. Then he admitted he'd been wrong about my abilities as a father and wrong about a lot of things when I was growing up. We set the bookshelf down in the truck and I thanked him for saying that. It wasn't a complete repair of our relationship, but it felt like a real start. Jean showed up at the new apartment the following weekend with a woman I'd never met before. Kieran introduced her as her mom, and I shook her hand feeling suddenly nervous about making a good impression. They brought housewarming gifts including kitchen supplies and a gift card to a local grocery store. Kieran's mom immediately started asking Isaac about school and his favorite subjects and whether he liked to read. He warmed up to her quickly and showed her his new room. She told him it was a perfect room for a smart boy like him and that she was so happy to have him as her grandson. Watching her treat Isaac like family without any hesitation made my throat tight with emotion. Jean caught my eye and nodded like he approved of how things were going. A few days later, Isaac was helping Kieran set up the nursery when he called her Miss Kieran instead of just Kieran. She stopped arranging baby clothes and looked at him with tears in her eyes. She asked him if he'd like to call her something else eventually, like maybe a name that showed she was special to him. He thought about it for a minute, then said he liked Miss Kieran for now because it felt right. She hugged him and told him that was perfect, and he could call her whatever made him comfortable. I stood in the doorway watching them and realized Isaac was finding his own way to accept her as part of our family. 30 days after Julio entered rehab, his counselor called my cell phone. She introduced herself and explained she was working with Julio on his recovery program. She asked if I'd be willing to participate in a family therapy session as part of his treatment plan. I hesitated because I wasn't sure if Julio was actually changing or just going through the motions to satisfy the court. She said family involvement was important for long-term success, but that I could set whatever boundaries I needed. I agreed to one session with clear limits about what I was willing to discuss. She scheduled it for the following week at the rehab facility. After I hung up, I told Kieran about it, and she squeezed my hand and said she'd support whatever decision I made about Julio. The therapy session happened the following Thursday at the rehab facility. I drove there alone because Kieran had to work, and honestly, I needed the time to prepare myself for seeing Julio again. The counselor met me in the lobby and walked me to a small room with a couch and 2 chairs. Julio came in a few minutes later looking cleaner than he had in months. His eyes were clear, and he sat down without the angry energy that usually followed him around. The counselor started by explaining the purpose of family therapy and recovery, and then asked Julio if he wanted to share anything with me. He looked at his hands for a long time before speaking. He said he was sorry for everything at the birthday party, and for the texts and showing up drunk at my apartment. Then he said something that surprised me. He told me he'd been jealous of me for years, even though everyone thought he was the successful one. He explained that watching me build a real family with Isaac while his marriage fell apart and his son struggled made something break inside him. He said it wasn't fair that the screw-up brother got to have the happy ending while the golden child lost everything. The counselor asked him to explain what he meant by that. Julio talked about how he always felt pressure to be perfect and how he resented that I seemed free from those expectations, even if it meant being the family joke. He said seeing me actually succeed as a father when everyone predicted I'd fail made him realize his own life was empty despite looking good on paper. He admitted he needed to focus on his own recovery and rebuilding his relationship with his son instead of tearing me down. I sat there listening and feeling a weird mix of anger and sadness. Part of me wanted to tell him how much damage he'd caused. Part of me understood that his jealousy came from a real place, even if his actions were wrong. When the counselor asked if I wanted to respond, I told Julio I was accepted his apology, but that rebuilding trust would take a long time. I explained that I needed to see real change over months, not just words in one therapy session before I'd consider letting him back into Isaac's life. The therapist nodded and told Julio that respecting my boundaries was an important part of his recovery process. She said he couldn't control my timeline for forgiveness, and that pushing for more access than I was comfortable with would only damage things further. Julio agreed and said he understood. The session ended with the counselor scheduling a follow-up in a month if I was willing. I said I'd think about it and left feeling drained, but also like maybe this was the beginning of something different between us. 2 weeks later, my mom called while I was making dinner. She told me that she and my dad had started attending Al-Anon meetings to learn how to support Julio without enabling his problems. Her voice sounded different from usual, less defensive and more honest. She said the meetings were helping them understand that asking me to bail Julio out had been wrong. She apologized for putting that pressure on me and said she understood now why I refused. I thanked her for telling me and said I was glad they were getting help too. It felt like the first real conversation we'd had in years, where she wasn't making excuses for Julio or dismissing my feelings. After I hung up, Kieran came into the kitchen and asked how it went. I told her about the Al-Anon meetings and she smiled and said my parents were finally taking responsibility. Then she sat down at the table and looked at me with this serious expression. She said she'd been thinking about us and the baby and our future. She asked if I'd want to get married at the courthouse before the baby arrived. She explained that she wanted to make our commitment official without the stress of planning a big wedding. I looked at her sitting there with her hand on her growing belly and felt this rush of certainty. I said yes immediately. We decided to invite just our parents and Isaac and Vanessa as witnesses. Keep it simple and focused on what actually mattered. The courthouse wedding happened on a Friday morning 3 weeks later. Isaac wore his nicest shirt and kept asking if he could see the rings. My parents arrived early, looking nervous but happy. Jean and Kieran's mom showed up right on time with flowers for Kieran. Vanessa hugged me and said she was proud of how far I'd come. We all stood in the small courthouse room while the judge performed the ceremony. Isaac stood between Kieran and me, holding our rings in his small hands. His face was bright with pride, like he understood this was his family becoming official. When the judge pronounced us married, both sets of parents had tears in their eyes. My mom hugged Kieran and called her daughter for the first time. My dad shook my hand and pulled me into an awkward hug. Jean kissed his daughter's cheek and nodded at me with approval. After the ceremony, we all went to Isaac's favorite pizza place to celebrate. Isaac told everyone at the table about how he got to hold the rings and how he was going to be the best big brother ever. The whole meal felt easy and natural, like this was how family was supposed to be. On Monday, Isaac told his class about the wedding during sharing time. His teacher sent home a folder that afternoon full of drawings his classmates had made of our family. Some showed me and Kieran and Isaac holding hands. Others included a baby in a basket or a crib. One kid drew our whole family as superheroes, which made Isaac laugh so hard he couldn't breathe. I hung every single drawing on the refrigerator in our new apartment. Looking at them made me think about how much community support we'd built without even trying. These kids knew Isaac's story and they celebrated our family anyway. A card arrived in the mail the following week with Julio's handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a simple congratulations message about the marriage. The note said he hoped to earn his way back into the family someday if I was ever willing. The words sounded genuine without any of his usual anger or sarcasm. I showed it to Kieran and we talked about how to respond. We decided to send a brief thank you note back. Nothing that made promises, but also nothing that completely closed the door. Just acknowledgement that we received his card and appreciated the sentiment. My auntie called 2 weeks later asking if she could host a small gathering to celebrate our marriage properly. I was hesitant at first, remembering that awful dinner where they all mocked me. But Kieran encouraged me to give them a chance to do better. The gathering happened on a Saturday afternoon at my auntie's house. The atmosphere was completely different from that first dinner. People asked real questions about my job and my life with Isaac. They complimented my parenting instead of making jokes. My uncle apologized again for his cruel comments about the hamster. My auntie made sure Kieran felt welcomed and included in every conversation. They asked about her teaching and her pregnancy with genuine interest. Isaac ran around playing with my nephew, and everyone commented on how happy and well-adjusted he seemed. My mom and dad sat together looking more relaxed than I'd seen them in months. It felt like the family was finally seeing me as an actual person instead of their designated failure. Jean pulled me aside near the end of the gathering. We stood in my auntie's backyard while kids played on the swing set. He told me he was wrong to doubt me when we first met. He said he could see now that I was exactly the kind of man his daughter and grandson deserved. He officially welcomed me into their family and said he was excited to meet his new grandchild in a few months. His acceptance meant more than I expected it to. Having Kieran's dad on my side felt like proof that I'd really become someone worth respecting. Isaac's school held a father-son event the next month. We showed up together and Isaac immediately started introducing me to his friends as his dad. No hesitation or awkwardness, just pure pride in his voice. Other parents came up to talk to me throughout the event. Some of them knew our adoption story from the school newsletters or from their kids. They complimented my dedication to Isaac and said nice things about how happy he always seemed. One dad told me he admired how I'd stepped up when Isaac needed someone. Another said his own son looked up to Isaac and wanted to be adopted too, which made me laugh. Standing there watching Isaac play games with his friends, I realized something important. I'd stopped feeling like I needed to prove myself to anyone except Isaac. My family's opinion didn't matter as much anymore. Julio's jealousy couldn't touch what I'd built. All that mattered was that Isaac felt loved and secure, and that our family was real regardless of what anyone else thought. 3 weeks before Kieran's due date, I woke up on a Saturday morning to her shaking my shoulder. She was having contractions 5 minutes apart, and her water had broken an hour ago. I jumped out of bed and started throwing things into the hospital bag we'd packed weeks earlier. Isaac appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes and asking what was happening. I told him the baby was coming early, and we needed to get him to Grandma and Grandpa's house right away. He got excited and started bouncing around asking if he could meet his sister today. I called my parents while helping Kieran to the car. My mom answered on the second ring and said to bring Isaac over immediately, that she'd have breakfast ready for him. The drive to my parents' house took 15 minutes, and I kept glancing at Kieran, who was breathing through contractions and timing them on her phone. Isaac sat in the back asking a million questions about whether the baby would be tiny and if she'd know who he was right away. When we pulled up to my parents' house, my mom was already waiting at the door. She took Isaac's hand and told me to go, that she'd take good care of him. Then she looked at me and said something I'd never heard before. She called me son with real warmth in her voice and told me to focus on Kieran and the baby, that everything would be okay. I felt something shift in my chest, but didn't have time to process it. I got back in the car and drove to the hospital with Kieran gripping my hand during every contraction. The labor lasted 12 hours. Kieran squeezed my hand so hard I thought she might break bones. The nurses came in and out checking her progress. I fed her ice chips and helped her walk around the room when she needed to move. Around hour 10, she started crying and saying she couldn't do it anymore. I stayed right next to her and reminded her how strong she was. Finally, the doctor said it was time to push. 30 minutes later, I heard a cry that changed everything. The nurse placed this tiny wrinkled baby on Kieran's chest. Our daughter Lily weighed 6 pounds and had a full head of dark hair. When I held her for the first time, my hands were shaking. She was so small and perfect and mine. The nurse who'd been helping with the delivery smiled and said I seemed like a natural with newborns. Kieran laughed even though she was exhausted and said I'd had plenty of practice being a dad already. I couldn't stop staring at Lily's face and thinking about how different my life looked now compared to a year ago. My parents brought Isaac to the hospital that afternoon to meet his baby sister. He walked into the room holding my mom's hand, and his eyes went wide when he saw the baby. I sat him in the chair next to Kieran's bed and carefully placed Lily in his arms while supporting her head. He stared at her with this amazed expression and asked why she was so small. Kieran explained that all babies start out tiny and grow bigger every day. Isaac wanted to know when she'd be able to play with him and if she knew he was her big brother. He asked about 10 more questions in rapid fire while gently touching Lily's tiny fingers. My dad stood back taking photos on his phone. I pulled out my own phone and captured the moment with Isaac holding Lily and smiling bigger than I'd ever seen. Looking at that photo later, I knew this was when our family became complete. Not when I adopted Isaac or when Kieran and I got married, but right here with both my kids together for the first time. We brought Lily home 3 days later and immediately fell into the chaos of newborn life. She woke up every 2 hours wanting to eat. Kieran and I took turns getting up at night, stumbling around the dark apartment half asleep. Isaac surprised us by being incredibly helpful. He'd fetch clean diapers without being asked and bring Kieran water while she fed the baby. When Lily cried, he'd sing the songs I used to sing to him when he first moved in. Sometimes I'd find him just standing next to her bassinet watching her sleep. Kieran and I were exhausted beyond anything I'd experienced before, but we worked together like a real team. She'd handle feeding while I changed diapers. I'd do laundry while she napped with the baby. We'd trade off holding Lily so the other could shower or eat. Even in the middle of the hardest nights when both kids needed something at the same time, it felt right. Like this was exactly what we were supposed to be doing. 2 weeks after we brought Lily home, a package arrived with Julio's name on the return address. Inside was a small pink teddy bear and a card. The card said congratulations on the new baby and mentioned he'd been sober for 90 days. He wrote that he was attending outpatient therapy twice a week and working on himself. He didn't ask to meet Lily or push for contact, just wanted us to know he was making progress. I showed the card to Kieran and we talked about how to respond. I appreciated that he was getting help and staying sober, but I wasn't ready to let him back into our lives yet, especially not around the kids. I wrote a brief thank you note for the gift without extending any invitation to visit. Maintaining boundaries felt important, even as I hoped his recovery was real. My dad started showing up every Sunday afternoon without fail. He'd spend an hour playing with Isaac in the living room while holding Lily and making faces at her. Isaac loved having his grandpa's attention and would show off his reading skills or tell stories about school. My dad seemed genuinely interested in everything Isaac said. He'd ask questions and laugh at Isaac's jokes and help him build elaborate block towers. With Lily, he was gentle and patient, letting her grip his finger while he talked to her in a soft voice. I'd watch him with both kids and see a different person than the father I grew up with. He was present and engaged in ways he'd never been with me or even with Julio's son. It felt like he was trying to be the grandfather he wished he'd been as a father. Jean and Kieran's mom became regular fixtures in our apartment during those early weeks. They'd come over with home-cooked meals and take Isaac to the park so Kieran and I could nap. Kieran's mom would hold Lily for hours, singing old lullabies and telling stories about when Kieran was a baby. Jean helped me assemble new furniture and fix a leaky faucet I'd been ignoring. They never made us feel like we were failing or struggling, just supported us through the hard parts. I found myself grateful for their presence in ways I couldn't quite express. After spending so many years feeling like the family outcast, I now had more family support than I knew what to do with. Both sets of parents invested in our kids and our success. It was strange and wonderful at the same time. 3 months after Lily's birth, Julio sent a text asking if we could meet for coffee. He said he wanted to show me his 6-month sobriety chip and talk about his progress. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Part of me wanted to ignore it and keep him at a distance. But another part was curious if he'd actually changed, or if this was just another manipulation. I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop downtown without the kids. I told Kieran where I'd be and promised to text her every 30 minutes so she'd know I was okay. The morning of the meeting, I was nervous in a way I couldn't quite name. Nervous he'd be drunk or angry. Nervous he'd try to guilt me into letting him meet Lily. Nervous that seeing him would bring back all the bad feelings from the birthday party. When Julio walked into the coffee shop, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked healthier than I'd seen him in years. His eyes were clear and focused. He'd gained some weight back and his skin didn't have that gray tint anymore. We sat down at a corner table and he pulled out a silver chip from his pocket. 6 months sober. He set it on the table between us like proof. Then he started talking and I just listened. He took full responsibility for everything that happened at Isaac's birthday party. Didn't make excuses about being drunk or jealous. Just owned that his behavior was wrong and hurtful. He talked about therapy and AA meetings and learning to deal with his anger. He mentioned rebuilding his relationship with his own son, taking it slow and proving he could be reliable. He said he understood if I never trusted him around my kids. That he'd earned my distrust and it would take years to rebuild anything between us. But he wanted me to know he was genuinely trying to become a better person. Not for me or for anyone else, but for himself. I sat there processing everything he said before responding. I told him I could see his progress and I was glad he was getting help. That seeing him healthy and clear-eyed gave me hope he might actually maintain his sobriety this time. But I was honest that rebuilding trust would be a slow process, that it would depend on him staying sober and respecting whatever boundaries I set, that my priority would always be protecting Isaac and Lily from instability. He nodded through everything I said and didn't argue or push back. He said he was willing to do whatever it took for as long as it took. That he knew he'd destroyed the relationship between us, and earning it back was completely on him. For the first time in our entire lives, we were having an honest conversation. No competition or resentment or family dynamics getting in the way, just two brothers trying to figure out if there was anything left to salvage between them. 6 months later, Thanksgiving at my parents' house felt like walking into a different universe. I carried Lily in her car seat while Isaac held Kieran's hand, and when we walked through the door, my mom actually hugged me first instead of making some joke. My dad took the car seat from me and cooed at Lily, calling her his granddaughter without any awkwardness. The table was set with actual place cards, and mine wasn't shoved at the end anymore. I sat between Kieran and Isaac, right in the middle of everything. Julio showed up an hour later, sober and carrying a pie he'd baked himself. He stayed quiet mostly, helping in the kitchen and playing with Isaac when asked, but never pushing. When my auntie started telling stories about family holidays, she included me in the good memories instead of making me the punchline. My uncle asked about my job and seemed genuinely interested in my answer. During dinner, my mom kept passing me dishes first and asking if Isaac needed anything. It was small stuff, but it mattered. Julio caught my eye once across the table and gave me a small nod, and I nodded back. After we ate, my dad suggested taking a family photo, and for the first time ever, he made sure I was in the center holding Lily with Isaac pressed against my side. When we left that night, my mom hugged me again and whispered that she was proud of me, and I actually believed her. 2 weeks later, I sat in the school parking lot reading Isaac's progress report from his 3rd grade teacher. She'd written a full page about how kind he was to other students, how he helped kids who were struggling, and how he talked about his family with so much love and pride. At the bottom, she'd added a personal note saying Isaac was one of the most emotionally healthy students she'd taught in 15 years, and she credited the stable home environment we'd created. I showed it to Kieran that night after Isaac went to bed, and we both sat there on the couch just staring at it. All those early days of burnt dinners and mismatched socks and panic phone calls to nurse hotlines had led to this. A happy, healthy kid who felt safe and loved enough to be kind to others. Kieran squeezed my hand and said we'd done good, and I finally let myself believe it. My parents started coming over every Sunday after that, bringing groceries and staying to help with whatever we needed. My mom would hold Lily while I helped Isaac with homework, and my dad would fix things around the apartment without me asking. They asked Kieran about her lesson plans and her students, treating her like she'd always been part of the family. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes my mom would say something that reminded me of the old days, or my dad would make a joke that landed wrong. But they were trying, really trying, and that was more than I'd ever expected. We'd never erased the years of them treating me like the family joke, but we'd found a way to move forward that felt workable. They were becoming the grandparents Isaac and Lily deserved, even if they'd never be the parents I'd needed growing up. 4 months after that Thanksgiving, Julio asked if he could see Isaac and Lily at my parents' house with everyone there. I agreed but stayed the whole time, watching how he interacted with them. He was patient with Isaac's questions and gentle when holding Lily. He didn't try to be their favorite uncle or compete for their attention. He just showed up and was present and appropriate. Over the next few months, he kept proving himself reliable. He came to Sunday dinners sober, helped my parents with projects, and never once pushed for more access than I was comfortable giving. He sent Isaac birthday cards and asked about school without making it weird. Slowly, carefully, I started trusting him around my kids for short visits while I stayed nearby. He never complained about my caution or tried to rush the process. He understood he'd destroyed the trust between us, and that earning it back was completely on him. When Isaac's 9th birthday rolled around, almost exactly a year after that disaster party, we threw a celebration at our apartment with both sides of the family. The place was packed with people, but the atmosphere was completely different. Jean and Kieran's mom brought a huge cake they'd decorated themselves. My parents arrived early to help set up. Julio came with a thoughtful gift he'd clearly put effort into choosing. Everyone sang happy birthday without any tension or undercurrent of judgment. Isaac blew out his candles while kids from his class ran around playing games. Kieran held Lily on her hip and helped serve cake. My mom and Kieran's mom chatted in the kitchen like old friends. My dad and Jean stood together watching the kids play, both of them smiling. Julio stayed appropriate the whole time, talking with family members and helping clean up without making anything about himself. When I looked around the room, I realized we'd actually built something real here. Something that lasted despite all the obstacles and doubts and drama. Late that night, after everyone left and Isaac finally crashed from his sugar high, I stood in the doorway of his room watching him sleep. Kieran came up behind me with Lily drowsy in her arms, and we just stood there looking at our family. I thought about that dinner table years ago, when they all laughed at the idea of me adopting. About my dad saying any kid of mine would need therapy before kindergarten. About my uncle joking that I couldn't even keep a hamster alive. They'd been so wrong about me, and I'd been so right to prove them wrong. My life wasn't perfect. My family relationships were still complicated and probably always would be. But I'd built exactly the kind of loving home I'd always dreamed of. Isaac was happy and healthy and kind. Lily was growing up surrounded by people who loved her. Kieran and I were partners in every sense of the word. My parents were trying to be better. Julio was working on himself. And me? I was just a dad doing his best, which turned out to be more than enough.